She left his mansion with 2 plastic bags and nothing else. No severance, no goodbye, no explanation. But what the billionaire found inside a crumbling shelter 3 blocks away would destroy everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman who raised his son. Stay with me until the end, hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The light over the Calloway estate had gone the color of weak tea, and Ethan Calloway stood at the tall window of his study with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched, watching a woman walk down his own driveway like she was leaving a funeral. She didn't look back. That was the thing that got him. 7 years, and she didn't look back once. Amelia Hart had 2 plastic bags, not suitcases, not even a duffel bag. Plastic grocery bags, the cheap kind that stretch and sag, knotted at the top so nothing would fall out. He could see the shape of folded clothes through the thin plastic, maybe a pair of shoes. That was it. That was everything she owned after 7 years in his house. Dad? His son Noah's voice came from the doorway, small and a little uncertain, the way it always sounded when he picked up on tension he couldn't name. Is Miss Amelia coming back tomorrow? Ethan didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the gate, on the woman growing smaller against the gravel. Dad? I don't know, buddy, he said finally, and the words tasted strange in his mouth, because Ethan Calloway always knew. He knew quarterly earnings before his CFO did. He knew which board members were lying in meetings by the way they touched their collars. He had built an empire by knowing things other people missed, and he had absolutely no idea why the most reliable person in his household had just walked out the door without asking him for a single thing. That was what kept eating at him. Not that she quit, people quit. Staff came and went, nannies left for better pay, housekeepers retired, drivers got better offers from other families with newer cars and shorter hours. That was the normal shape of these things. There was a script for it, a notice, a negotiation, sometimes tears, sometimes a counteroffer that fixed everything. Amelia hadn't followed the script. She'd come to him that morning in the kitchen, hands folded in front of her apron, like she was about to ask permission for something small, and instead she'd said, Mr. Calloway, I need to resign. Today, if that's all right. I'm sorry for the short notice. He'd looked up from his coffee, genuinely confused. Resign? Amelia, is something wrong? Did someone say something to you? If it's about the schedule, we can... It's not the schedule. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. There was something moving behind them, something she was holding very still, the way you hold still when you're carrying a full glass of water and don't want it to spill. I just need to go. Thank you for 7 good years. At least let me give you severance. 2 months' pay, that's the least... No. It came out fast, almost sharp, and then she softened it. No, thank you. I don't need it. That was the part that haunted him the most as he stood at the window now. Not the resignation, the refusal of money. In Ethan's world, money was the universal solvent. It dissolved every problem he'd ever encountered, smoothed every rough edge, closed every gap. People didn't refuse money. Not people who lived the way Amelia lived, in the small staff apartment above the garage, who wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation, who he'd once seen mending a tear in her work shoes with dental floss because she didn't want to ask for new ones. She had refused money. And she had looked, in that moment, like someone trying very hard not to cry in front of her employer. Noah tugged at his sleeve. Dad, you're being weird. I know, bud. Ethan crouched down to his son's height, the way he always did when he needed Noah to really hear him. 5 years old and already sharper than half his board of directors, this kid. I need you to stay here with Mrs. Petrakis for a little while, okay? I have to go check on something. Is it about Miss Amelia? Yeah. Is she okay? Ethan looked at his son's face, that small, worried face that had lost its mother 3 years ago and had somehow, impossibly, kept finding reasons to trust the world again. And he felt something tighten in his chest. I'm going to find out. He didn't take the car. That was a decision he made in about half a second, the kind of decision that didn't feel like a decision at all, more like his legs just started moving before his brain finished the thought. If he pulled the Bentley around, she'd hear it, she'd see it, and whatever this was, whatever she was hiding, wherever she was actually going, She'd have time to put a mask back on before he caught up to her. He didn't want the mask. He wanted to see whatever was underneath it. So he walked. In a $4,000 coat, down his own gravel driveway, out through the gate his security team usually only opened for cars, into a neighborhood he hadn't set foot in for longer than it took to get from a car door to a restaurant entrance in 15 years. The streets changed fast once you got 6 blocks from his house. The gated communities thinned out, the hedges got lower, then disappeared, then the sidewalks started cracking, then half the streetlights were out. Ethan Calloway had grown up with money. Not this much, not always. His father had clawed half of it together before Ethan tripled it. But he still remembered what cracked sidewalks looked like. He just hadn't walked on one in a long time. Amelia walked fast, faster than he expected for someone carrying 2 bags. She didn't check her phone, didn't look in shop windows, didn't slow down once. She walked like a woman with somewhere specific to be and not much time to get there, head down against the wind that had picked up with the dark. He stayed back, far enough that she wouldn't notice a man in an expensive coat trailing her, close enough that he wouldn't lose her at a turn. It felt insane. It felt, frankly, a little like stalking, and some small rational part of his brain kept asking him what exactly he thought he was doing. A 32-year-old man who ran a logistics empire worth more than some small country's GDP, following his former housekeeper through a part of town his security detail would have a heart attack about. But he kept walking. 20 minutes in, the neighborhood changed again. Older buildings now, brick gone gray with decades of exhaust, a laundromat with half its sign burned out, a corner store with bars on the windows. And then Amelia turned down a narrow street he almost lost her on, and stopped in front of a building that looked like it had been 3 different things in 3 different decades and had settled, finally, into something tired. A faded sign above the door read, "Sunrise House, a home for children." The paint so old it had gone the color of weak coffee. Ethan stopped across the street, half hidden behind a delivery truck that had been left running, its hazards blinking yellow against the dusk. Amelia didn't knock. She had a key. The door opened, and before it had even swung halfway, before she'd taken a single step inside, 3 small shapes came barreling toward her out of the dim hallway light. A girl, maybe 7, threw both arms around Amelia's waist. A boy slightly older grabbed her hand with both of his like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. A smaller one, maybe 4, just stood there with his arms up, waiting to be lifted. And Amelia dropped both plastic bags right there on the doorstep and scooped him onto her hip without a second of hesitation. "I missed you so much," the older girl said, muffled against Amelia's coat. "Miss Carroll said you might not come because of your job, and I said no way, Miss Amelia always comes." "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Amelia's voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, in a way Ethan had never once heard in 7 years of her working in his house. "I'm not going anywhere." Across the street, standing half hidden behind a truck that wasn't his, Ethan Calloway felt the bottom drop out of something inside his chest. He had spent 7 years assuming he knew the broad shape of this woman's life. Quiet, reliable, modest. He paid her well, not extravagantly, but fairly, more than market rate, because he liked to think of himself as a decent employer. He'd assumed that money went toward rent, toward bills, toward whatever small life a single woman with no family that he knew of might build for herself on a housekeeper's salary in a city this expensive. He had never once imagined this. A building full of children who lit up like he'd never seen anyone light up. Not at birthday parties, not at Christmas, not even when Noah unwrapped the gifts Ethan spent absurd amounts of money curating, just because Amelia Hart had walked through a door. He crossed the street before he'd fully decided to. The window beside the entrance was cracked open an inch, propped with a folded magazine, probably for ventilation against a heating system that sounded, even from outside, like it was working too hard. Ethan stood beside it, not quite hiding, not quite announcing himself, and listened. Inside, an older woman's voice, tired, warm, the voice of someone who'd been doing something difficult for a very long time, was talking to Amelia. "You didn't have to come tonight, of all nights. You just quit your job, Amelia. You should be resting, looking for the next thing, not, I wanted to see them." A pause. The sound of a bag being set down, zippers, the small domestic noise of someone settling in. "Carol, How bad is it really? A long silence. Long enough that Ethan found himself holding his breath without meaning to. Bad, the older woman, Carol, finally said. The city inspector came by Tuesday. Boilers failing, electrical's not up to code, and the landlord selling the building whether we can pay or not. We owe 4 months on top of that. I've called every foundation in this city, Amelia. I've called people I haven't spoken to in 15 years out of pride. Nobody's biting. Not in this economy, not for 12 kids nobody's heard of in a building that's falling apart. How long do we have? 3 weeks? Maybe 4, if I beg. Ethan heard Amelia exhale, slow and controlled, the kind of breath someone takes when they're trying very hard not to let their voice break in front of children who can hear everything. Then I'll figure it out, Amelia said. I told you, I'm not letting this place close. Not after 7 years, not after everything. Sweetheart, you just walked away from a steady paycheck. How exactly are you going to us? I'll figure it out, Carol. Her voice had an edge now, not unkind, just exhausted in a way that made something in Ethan's chest hurt to hear. I always do. Outside the window, in the cold, in a coat that cost more than this building's monthly heating bill, Ethan Calloway stood very still and finally understood that he had followed a woman home expecting to solve a mystery. And instead he'd found something that made him feel, for the first time in years, genuinely small. He thought about his own 7 years. Losing Claire when Noah was barely 2. The nights he'd sat on the nursery floor at 3 in the morning because the silence of the house felt like it might swallow him before he hired the first nanny, before he hired Amelia, before any of the structure he'd built around his grief had hardened into something livable. People had helped him then. Not with money, he'd had plenty of that, but with small, specific kindnesses he never fully repaid. A neighbor who watched Noah for an afternoon so Ethan could grieve somewhere private. A pediatric nurse who stayed 45 minutes past her shift because she could see he was drowning. He remembered all of it, every name, and he had never once gone back to thank any of them properly, because by the time he had the bandwidth to remember kindness, he also had the money to forget he'd ever needed it. And here was a woman who had been quietly carrying an entire building full of other people's grief and need for 7 years, on a housekeeper's salary, telling no one, asking for nothing. And the first time he'd seen the real shape of her life was by accident, through a cracked window, like a thief. He didn't go in. Not that night. He stood there a long time, long enough that the cold worked its way through his coat, and then he turned and walked the 20 minutes back to his estate in the dark, hands in his pockets, saying nothing to the security guard who buzzed him through the gate with obvious confusion at his employer arriving home on foot. Noah was already in bed when he got back, but not asleep. Ethan could tell by the way the hallway light under his door kept flickering with shadow, the universal sign of a kid still awake and pretending not to be. He knocked softly and pushed the door open. Noah sat up immediately. Did you find her? I did. Is she okay? Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight, and for a second he didn't know how to answer a 5-year-old's question honestly without it turning into something too big for a 5-year-old to carry. She's going to be okay, he said finally. I'm going to make sure of it. Promise? Promise. He stayed there until Noah's breathing evened out and slowed, until his small hand, still curled loosely around the edge of his blanket, finally went slack with sleep. Then Ethan went back downstairs, poured the bourbon he still hadn't touched down the kitchen sink, and sat at the counter with his phone in front of him for a long time without dialing anyone. He kept thinking about the boy who'd lifted his arms to be carried, about the girl who said Miss Amelia always comes like it was a law of physics, an immutable fact of the universe, more reliable than gravity, about a building with a failing boiler and 3 weeks left, and a woman who'd just quit the best-paying, most stable job she'd probably ever had, with no plan beyond, I'll figure it out, because the alternative was watching that certainty break for a dozen kids who already knew too much about things breaking. He thought, too, about the moment in the kitchen that morning. I don't need it, and how wrong he'd had it, assuming that was pride or independence or some strange housekeeper's dignity he didn't fully understand. It hadn't been pride at all. She hadn't refused his severance because she didn't need money. She'd refused it because 2 months' pay wasn't going to be enough to save that building, And taking it from him would have meant explaining why she needed so much more than that. And explaining meant asking, and asking, for reasons he didn't yet understand but was determined to find out, was apparently the one thing Amelia Hart would not do. Not even to save the only thing in this world that seemed to matter to her. Ethan sat in his kitchen until almost 2 in the morning, the city outside dark and quiet, his phone screen dimming and lighting up again every time he nudged it. And somewhere around 1:30, he stopped thinking about it as a mystery to solve and started thinking about it as a debt he hadn't known he owed. 7 years. 12 kids. 3 weeks. He didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time since Claire died, when he finally did close his eyes, it wasn't grief keeping him awake. It was the beginning of a plan. By morning, he had already made 2 calls. One to his property attorney, one to a man named Russo, who handled acquisitions nobody else wanted to touch. And neither of them yet knew exactly what he was building toward, only that their billionaire client wanted information on a crumbling 4-story building 3 blocks past the edge of the gentrified part of town, and wanted it fast, and wanted absolutely no one to mention his name to anyone connected to it. Because Ethan Calloway had decided something standing on that cold street the night before, something he hadn't said out loud yet even to himself. He wasn't just going to help. He was going to find out exactly who Amelia Hart really was, and why a woman who owned almost nothing had quietly become, to 12 children in a dying building, the richest person they had ever known. Russo called back at 9 the next morning, and Ethan picked up before the second ring finished. "Building's owned by a holding company out of Delaware," Russo said, his voice flat with the particular boredom of a man who'd done this kind of digging 1,000 times. 3 shell layers deep, but I got to the actual owner. Guy named Patterson owns about a dozen properties on that side of town, mostly lets them rot until the land's worth more than the building, then sells to developers. He's already got a buyer lined up for this one. Some condo group wants to tear it down, put up 60 units. How fast? Closing's in 3 weeks. The nonprofit's already 4 months behind on rent, so legally he doesn't even need to wait that long. He could evict them tomorrow if he wanted. He's just letting it ride because the sale's already in motion, and eviction paperwork is a headache he doesn't need. Ethan stood at his kitchen island, still in yesterday's shirt, a cup of coffee gone cold beside his elbow. I want to buy it before he does. Today, if I can. Today's not realistic, but I can get you in front of him by tomorrow afternoon if you're serious. You sure about this? This building's a liability, Ethan. Boilers from the Carter administration. Half the wiring needs to be gutted. There's probably asbestos in the insulation. You'd be buying yourself a money pit. I'm aware of what I'd be buying. And the kids inside it? The nonprofit? That stays. That's the point. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the night's lack of sleep settle into his shoulders. I don't want my name anywhere near this until it's done. Not Patterson, not the nonprofit, nobody. Structure it through a holding company, something clean, something that doesn't trace back to Calloway Logistics or to me personally. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that meant Russo was recalibrating his understanding of what kind of deal this actually was. You don't want credit for this. I don't want credit. I want it done quietly. That's a first for you. A lot of firsts this week, Ethan said, and hung up before Russo could ask what that meant. He didn't go to the office that day. His assistant, Margaret, called twice, first about a board call he'd missed, second about a journalist requesting comment on a logistics contract dispute in Singapore, and both times he told her to push everything to Thursday. She didn't argue. In 11 years of working for him, she'd learned that when Ethan Calloway said push it, the reasons were usually good ones, even when he didn't explain them. But she did ask, carefully, if everything was all right at home. Everything's fine, he told her. I just need a few days. What he actually needed was time to think, because buying the building was the easy part, the part that only required money, and Ethan had more of that than he could ever spend in 3 lifetimes. The harder part was the part he hadn't said out loud to Russo or to anyone. He wanted to understand Amelia Hart before he handed her a miracle. Because some instinct in him, sharpened by a decade of reading people across boardroom tables, told him that if he showed up too fast, too loud, with too much money, she would not feel saved. She would feel exposed. And a woman who had spent 7 years hiding the most important thing in her life from the man who employed her was not going to react well to that man, suddenly knowing everything and fixing it without asking. So instead of calling her, instead of driving over with a checkbook and a smile, he went back to Sunrise House the next afternoon. Not in disguise, exactly. He didn't own clothes humble enough to disappear into that neighborhood, even if he'd tried. But he left the watch at home, wore the plainest coat he owned, and told his driver to park 2 blocks away and wait. Carol answered the door this time. She was somewhere in her 60s, silver-haired, with the particular posture of someone who'd spent decades standing on her feet doing things nobody thanked her for. She looked at Ethan with the wary, assessing expression of a woman who'd had a lot of men in expensive coats show up at her door over the years, almost none of whom had been there to help. "We're not taking donations of clothing right now," she said before he could even speak. "Storage is full." "I'm not here to donate clothing." "Then what are you here for? Because if you're from the city, the inspection report already went out. You don't need to—" "I'm not from the city." Ethan hesitated and then decided the only way through this was straight through it. "My name's Ethan Calloway. I think you know who employed Amelia Hart until 2 days ago." Something shifted in Carol's face. Recognition, then suspicion, fast enough that Ethan almost missed it. "You're her boss." "Was. She quit." "I know she quit. I was there when she told me why." Carol crossed her arms, blocking the doorway with her body more than the door itself. "If you're here to ask her to come back, you can save your breath. She's not changing her mind. That girl doesn't change her mind once she's decided something." "I'm not here to ask her to come back." "Then what do you want?" Ethan looked past Carol's shoulder into the dim hallway behind her, where he could hear the muffled sound of children's voices and a television playing something with a laugh track, the volume turned low like even the joy in this building had learned to be careful about how much space it took up. "I want to understand what I'm looking at," he said. "Before I do anything, I want to understand it. Can I come in?" Carol studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that felt like it was weighing more than just his face. His shoes, the cut of his coat, the way he stood, whether his eyes moved toward the children's voices with curiosity or discomfort. Whatever she found, it must have tipped some scale, because she finally stepped back and let the door swing wider. "5 minutes," she said. "And if Amelia walks in and you upset her, you're out, money or no money." "Understood." Inside, the building was exactly as worn as it had looked from the street, but worn in a way that told its own story. Patched walls painted in bright, mismatched colors, clearly by hands that cared more about cheerfulness than precision. A hallway lined with children's drawings taped up in crooked rows. A bulletin board crowded with photographs of birthday parties, field trips, a Christmas tree decorated with construction paper ornaments. The wiring Russo had mentioned was visible in places. Exposed conduit running along the ceiling where the walls had been opened up and never properly closed. The air smelled like old radiators and something baking, cinnamon maybe, underneath the must. 12 kids, Carol said, leading him down the hall, answering the question before he asked it. Ages 4 to 14. Some of them have been here since before I took over running this place, which was 11 years ago. Some came last year. Doesn't matter how long, but once they're here, they're family. And family doesn't get kicked out because the city decided this neighborhood's worth more as condos than as a place for kids nobody else wanted. How did Amelia get involved? Carol stopped at the end of the hallway, in front of a closed office door, and turned to face him fully for the first time. You really don't know? No. She showed up here 8 years ago, younger than most of our volunteers, scared half to death, said she'd seen a flyer at a laundromat. First few months, she barely talked to anyone, just helped with whatever needed doing. Dishes, laundry, reading to the little ones at bedtime. Took us almost a year to get her to tell us anything real about herself. Carol's voice softened, the suspicion draining out of it slowly, replaced by something closer to protectiveness. She told me once, late one night when we were both exhausted and the filters were down, that she grew up in a place like this. Different city, different name, same situation. Bounced through 3 different homes before she aged out of the system at 18 with nothing. No family to go back to, no money, nowhere to land. She said the only reason she survived that first year on her own was because one caretaker at one of those homes looked her in the eye and told her she mattered. Just that. Nothing more dramatic than that. And she said she never forgot it, and she promised herself that if she ever had anything to give, she'd give it to kids like she'd been. Ethan felt something tighten in his throat that he hadn't expected. 7 years she'd worked in his house. 7 years of cooking dinners, helping Noah with homework, sitting up some nights when the boy had nightmares about a mother he barely remembered. And Ethan had never once asked her where she came from. He'd asked about her availability, her references, her comfort level with a 5-year-old who sometimes screamed himself awake. He had never asked her story. She started volunteering every Friday, Carol continued. Then it became every Friday and most Sundays. Then she started bringing groceries out of her own pocket when our food budget ran short. Then she started covering little things, a kid's shoes when they outgrew the old ones, a birthday cake when the budget didn't stretch to it, a winter coat when the donation bin came up empty. I told her to stop, more than once. Told her she was barely making enough to live on herself. She didn't need to be subsidizing a children's home on top of it. Carol shook her head, something between a laugh and a sigh. She never listened, said if she had it and a kid needed it, the math wasn't complicated. And the resigning. Why now? Why not sooner if the building's been struggling? Because it's never been this bad. We've had close calls before it. A bad month, a donor pulling out, a grant falling through. But we always found a patch, always scraped together enough to limp to the next month. This time the landlord's actually selling. There's no patch for that. You can't fundraise your way out of a building that's already got a buyer. Carol's jaw tightened. She came to me 3 weeks ago, the day we got the notice, and she said, "I'll figure something out." I didn't think much of it. She always says that, and somehow she always does figure something out. God knows how on what she makes. But 2 days ago, she walks in and tells me she quit your job, no notice, no severance, because she's going to find something that pays more, something that can actually cover what we need before the closing date. Does she have any leads? Any actual plan? Carol's expression answered before her words did. She's been calling every staffing agency, every cleaning company, every household in this city that might pay double what you were paying her for the kind of hours that would let her still come here on weekends. I don't think she's slept more than 4 hours a night since the notice came. She thinks if she just works hard enough, fast enough, she can outrun 3 weeks and 4 months of back rent. Carol's voice cracked, just slightly, the first real crack Ethan had heard in the woman's composure since he'd walked in. I haven't told her the truth, which is that even if she found a job paying triple what you gave her, there's no way she earns and saves enough in 3 weeks to stop a sale that's already in motion. I haven't told her because I don't have the heart to take away the one thing she's holding on to right now. Ethan stood in that narrow hallway, surrounded by crooked construction paper ornaments and photographs of birthdays celebrated on a shoestring, and felt the full weight of what he was about to do settle into something more solid than an idea. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a check handed across a desk. This was a woman who had built her entire sense of self around being the person who gave, who fixed, who showed up. And the only way to actually help her was going to require letting her receive something, which Carol had just made very clear was the one thing Amelia Hart did not know how to do gracefully. "I want to buy the building," he said. Carol's eyebrows went up, but she didn't look surprised exactly, more like a woman watching a card she'd suspected was in the deck finally get played. Just like that. Just like that. Through a holding company, nothing in my name, nothing that traces back to me or to her. I want the back rent cleared, the boiler replaced, the wiring brought up to code, and I want a fund set up that covers operating costs for this place permanently, so this conversation never happens again. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this building is never one missed donation away from closing. And Amelia, I want her to know I'm doing it, eventually. Not as a transaction, not as some kind of repayment for 7 years of work, or a tax write-off with a nice story attached. I want her to understand that someone saw what she's been carrying and decided it shouldn't be hers to carry alone anymore. Carol studied him again, longer this time, and something in her face shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. You understand what you're describing isn't really about the building. I'm starting to. She spent her whole life being the one who gives, the one who doesn't need anything. If you walk in here with a check and a smile, expecting her to fall apart with gratitude, you're going to be disappointed, and you might do real damage. People like Amelia don't know how to be on the receiving end of kindness. It scares them more than poverty does. Carol's voice gentled. Whatever you do, do it in a way that lets her keep some piece of her dignity intact. Don't make this about you being the billionaire who swooped in and saved the poor housekeeper. Make it about the kids. She'll be able to accept it if it's about the kids. It was, Ethan thought later, walking the 2 blocks back to where his car was waiting, some of the best advice anyone had given him in years, and it had come from a 60-something woman in a cardigan with flour on her sleeve, standing in a hallway that smelled like old radiators, who had never once asked him for anything either. He didn't see Amelia that day. Carol said she'd gone out to call another agency, chasing another lead, another long shot at outrunning a closing date that was never going to be outrun by hourly wages alone. Ethan left without leaving his name on anything, without leaving so much as a business card, and told Carol only that she'd be hearing from him soon, through channels that wouldn't put her in an awkward position if Amelia asked questions. That night, he sat with Noah at the kitchen table while the boy did his homework, half his attention on a worksheet of addition problems, and half of it, clearly, somewhere else. "You found her," Noah said, not really a question. "Is the shelter place going to be okay?" Ethan blinked. "How do you know about the shelter?" "You talk on the phone with the door open sometimes," Noah said matter-of-factly, the way kids say things that completely demolish whatever privacy adults think they have. "I heard you say Sunrise House like 10 times yesterday." Ethan laughed despite himself, a short, surprised sound, the first real laugh he'd managed in 2 days. "You're not supposed to be eavesdropping, bud." "I wasn't trying to. You were just loud." Noah set his pencil down, looking at his father with the unnervingly direct gaze he sometimes had, the one that reminded Ethan so much of Claire it physically ached. "Is Miss Amelia going to come back to work for us?" "I don't think so, buddy. I think she's got something more important to do right now." "More important than us?" Noah's voice had a small wobble in it, the wobble of a kid who'd already lost one important person and was bracing automatically for the universe to take another. Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over his son's. "Not more important than you. Different important. You know how she always made sure you had a snack ready exactly when you got home from school, even before you asked?" Noah nodded. "There's a whole house full of kids who need someone to do that for them, and nobody else is doing it. So Miss Amelia's been spending years making sure they have what they need, the same way she made sure you did. She just never told us." Noah considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old processing something genuinely large. "That's kind of like a secret superhero thing." "Yeah," Ethan said, something catching in his chest. "Kind of exactly like that." "Are we going to help her?" "With the kids." "We are. We're going to help in a way that lets her keep doing what she's been doing, just without it being so hard on her anymore." "Can I help too?" Ethan looked at his son's earnest, addition worksheet smudged face and felt, for the first time in days, something that wasn't anxiety or grief or the cold calculation of acquisitions and shell companies. It was something closer to hope. "Yeah," he said. "I think you definitely can." The next 2 weeks moved fast, faster than Ethan would have thought possible for a deal this complicated, mostly because he stopped treating speed as a luxury and started treating it as the only thing standing between 12 kids and a wrecking ball. Russo got him in front of Patterson within 4 days, and the negotiation, which Ethan had expected to be delicate, turned out to be almost insultingly simple. Patterson didn't care who bought the building, didn't care what happened to the nonprofit currently squatting inside it past their lease terms, cared only about getting more than the condo developer had offered. And Ethan, who had once spent 11 months negotiating a shipping contract over half a percentage point, found he was perfectly willing to simply pay whatever made the man go away fastest. The holding company, registered under a name that meant nothing to anyone, Brightline Civic Partners, vague enough to sound like 100 other faceless entities, closed on the building 11 days after Ethan first stood outside it in the cold. The renovation plans took longer, mostly because Ethan refused to let it be done cheaply or fast in a way that cut corners, which felt, to him, like it would have defeated the entire point. He brought in a contractor who specialized in nonprofit and school renovations, someone with a track record of building things that lasted, not things that looked good in a press photo and fell apart in 5 years. New boiler, new wiring, fully up to code, inspected 3 times. A structural engineer to look at the foundation, which turned out to need work too, more than anyone had expected, more than Ethan had budgeted for, and he approved every overage without blinking, because somewhere in the last 2 weeks the numbers stopped mattering to him in the way numbers used to matter. The hardest part wasn't the money. The hardest part was the silence, keeping all of it invisible, keeping Amelia from finding out, while she spent those same 2 weeks calling agencies, taking interviews for housekeeping jobs that paid marginally more than his had, growing visibly more exhausted every time Carol gave him an update. Because Carol had become, without either of them quite planning it, his only line of communication into Amelia's daily life. She took a job, Carol told him on day 12, her voice tight over the phone. Some wealthy family on the east side, longer hours, slightly better pay. She starts Monday. She thinks if she works 6 days a week and doesn't spend a cent on herself, she might be able to put together enough for a partial payment to the new owner by the time the lease runs out, buy us a few more months while she keeps looking for more. The new owner, Ethan said carefully, isn't going to evict anyone. She doesn't know that. She doesn't know who the new owner is. None of us do, officially. There was an edge in Carol's voice now, something close to frustration. Ethan, I don't know how much longer I can keep watching her run herself into the ground over a fight that's already over. It feels cruel, letting her keep fighting this hard when you already won. I know. Ethan rubbed his eyes, sitting in his study at nearly midnight, blueprints for the renovated shelter spread across his desk alongside quarterly reports he hadn't looked at in days. I know it feels that way. I just need a little more time to make sure this is done right. I don't want to tell her it's handled and then have something fall through. I want her to walk into a finished thing, not a promise. And how much longer is a little more time? 1 more week, maybe 10 days. Carol was quiet for a moment. She asked about you yesterday. Ethan sat up straighter. What did she say? She asked if Noah was doing okay, if you'd found someone good to help with him. A small, tired laugh. She still worries about your son, you know, even after everything. Even working herself half to death trying to save this place, she's worried whether some 5-year-old she used to make pancakes for is eating breakfast. Something about that detail undid Ethan more than anything else had in 2 weeks of negotiations and blueprints and silent financial maneuvering, because it confirmed, in the smallest and most ordinary way possible, exactly the kind of person Carol had described in that hallway. Someone who gave without checking whether there was anything left in the tank, who worried about a child who no longer had any claim on her time or attention, simply because once she'd decided to care about someone, the caring didn't have an expiration date. Tell her Noah's fine, Ethan said. Tell her he asks about her almost every day. Tell her yourself, Carol said. Soon. Whatever you're building, Ethan, finish it, because that girl is running on fumes and stubbornness. And one of those 2 things is going to give out before the other does, and I'd rather it not be her. He hung up and looked at the blueprints again. The new classroom space where a storage closet used to be. The safety railings for the rickety back stairs. The playground equipment ordered for the small concrete lot behind the building that currently held nothing but a rusted swing set with 2 broken chains. 10 more days, he told the contractor the next morning, not 10 more weeks. Whatever it cost to compress the timeline, he'd pay it. He thought, often in those final days, about what Carol had said in that first conversation, that this wasn't really about the building. He thought about a 4-year-old reaching up to be carried, about a girl saying Miss Amelia always comes with the absolute certainty of a law of nature, and about a woman who had spent her entire adult life proving, over and over, in 100 small, unglamorous ways, that she could be trusted to show up for people who had learned, the hard way, that most people didn't. He thought about the fact that he was about to hand her the one thing she had never let herself ask for, help, freely given, without strings, without a debt attached. And he thought, with a kind of dawning unease that sat uncomfortably alongside all his careful planning, that Carol might be right, that the money and the boiler and the new wiring were going to be the easy part, and the hard part was going to be the conversation where he had to look Amelia Hart in the eye and explain why a man who barely knew her story had spent 2 weeks and a fortune rewriting the ending to a fight she'd believed. Until that moment, only she was fighting. The 10 days stretched longer than Ethan expected. The way every deadline does when you're watching someone else run themselves thin against a clock they don't know has already stopped. Amelia's new job, Carol reported, was worse than any of them had anticipated. The family on the east side wanted her there by 6 in the morning and rarely let her leave before 9 at night, and they paid better than Ethan had technically, but the hours ate any advantage the higher wage might have given her. She was sleeping less. Carol said she'd started coughing, a dry, persistent thing that sounded like exhaustion settling into her chest, and that she'd shown up at Sunrise House the previous Friday so gray in the face that one of the older kids, a 14-year-old named Diego, had asked her point blank if she was dying. She laughed it off, Carol told Ethan over the phone, her voice carrying none of the humor of the story. Told him she was just tired. But Ethan, she's not just tired. She's running herself into the ground for a fight she doesn't know is already won, and I'm running out of ways to comfort her without lying outright. 10 more days, Ethan said, though even as he said it, the number felt less like a plan and more like a wall he was asking Carol to keep holding up by herself. You said that a week ago. I know. The structural work took longer than the engineer estimated. I'm not going to hand her a building with cracks in the foundation just to make a deadline I set myself. He pressed his palm against his eyes, sitting in his office at nearly 11 at night, the city lights through the window doing nothing to make him feel less alone in the decision he'd made. I need it to be right, Carol, not fast. Right. And if she collapses before it's right? That question sat with him long after the call ended, long enough that he found himself standing in Noah's doorway at midnight, watching his son sleep, thinking about the particular cruelty of trying to do the right thing too carefully, too slowly, while someone else's body kept the score in real currency. Exhaustion, a cough that wouldn't quit, the gray pallor of someone burning candle and wick both. He called the contractor first thing the next morning and told him money was no longer a variable. Whatever it cost to finish the essential safety work in 5 days instead of 10, he'd pay it, and the cosmetic work, the paint, the classroom furniture, the playground equipment, could continue after the reveal, while the kids were already living somewhere structurally sound and properly heated. 5 days, the contractor said slowly, the kind of slow that meant he was doing math in his head about overtime crews and rush deliveries. It's going to cost you double what we discussed. Triple it if you need to. I just need the boiler running, the wiring certified, and the foundation work signed off by an inspector who isn't going to find anything wrong 6 months from now. It got done in 6 days, not 5, but 6 was close enough. And on the 7th morning, Ethan stood in the newly finished hallway of Sunrise House. Wiring exposed nowhere now, walls freshly patched and primed, the smell of old radiators replaced by the chemical sharpness of new paint not yet dry, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, nervous, genuinely, physically nervous, the kind of nervous he hadn't experienced since he was 26 years old, pitching his first major shipping contract to a room of skeptical executives who didn't believe a kid that age could run logistics at scale. Carol had agreed to call Amelia in for what she'd been told was a meeting about the building's future. Vague enough to be true, specific enough that Amelia, exhausted as she was, would show up expecting bad news and brace herself for it the way she'd been bracing herself for bad news for 3 weeks straight. She walked in at 4 in the afternoon, still in her work uniform from the East Side family's house, dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there a month ago, and stopped dead in the hallway the moment she saw the fresh paint. "What happened in here?" she asked Carol, her voice sharpening with something close to alarm. "Did the new owner already start work? Are they renovating it to sell it faster? Carol, what's going—" "Amelia." Carol's voice was gentle, careful, the voice of someone walking a tightrope. "Come into the office. There's someone here who wants to talk to you." Amelia's eyes found Ethan standing near the office doorway, and her whole body went rigid, the particular rigidity of someone encountering something so far outside their expected reality that their nervous system hasn't caught up yet. "Mr. Calloway?" "Hi, Amelia." "What are you doing here?" The question came out sharper than she probably meant it to, fear bleeding into irritation the way it does when someone's already at the end of their rope and one more unexpected thing tips them over. "Did something happen? Is Noah okay?" "Noah's fine. He's at home with Mrs. Petrakis." Ethan kept his voice as steady and unthreatening as he could manage, aware suddenly of every word's weight, of Carol's earlier warning ringing in his head. Don't make this about you being the billionaire who swooped in. I'm here about the building. The building. Amelia's eyes darted to the fresh paint again, to the new outlets visible along the baseboards, understanding dawning across her face in a way that looked less like relief and more like dread. What did you do? Can we sit down? What did you do, Mr. Calloway? There was no soft way into this, Ethan realized. He'd spent 2 weeks planning the renovation, the timeline, the financial structure, and he had spent almost no time at all planning the actual words for this exact moment, because some part of him had assumed that once the building was safe, once the threat was gone, the relief would simply arrive on its own and carry the conversation for him. Looking at Amelia's face now, not grateful, not relieved, but braced, almost frightened, like a woman watching a wave she didn't ask for come crashing toward something she'd built with her own hands, he understood how badly he'd misjudged that. I bought the building, he said, through a company that has nothing to do with my name, my businesses, anything that would trace back to me. I closed on it 18 days ago. The back rent's been paid in full. The boiler's been replaced, the wiring's been brought up to code, the foundation's been repaired and inspected. He paused. There's a fund set up, an endowment, structured so it pays out operating costs every year indefinitely, regardless of what happens to me or my businesses or anything else. This building isn't closing. It's never closing again, not because of money. Amelia stood completely still for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. Why? It wasn't a question shaped like gratitude. It was a question shaped like suspicion, almost like accusation, and Ethan felt the careful speech he'd half prepared in the car evaporate completely. Because I followed you, he said. That night you left. I watched you walk 3 blocks and through that door, and I watched a room full of kids run to you like you were the only stable thing in their lives. And then I stood outside that window and listened to you tell Carol you'd figure it out, after just quitting the most reliable income you've probably ever had, with no plan, because you couldn't stand the idea of this place closing. He took a breath. I've known you 7 years, Amelia. I had no idea any of this existed. Not the shelter, not the 8 years of Fridays, not the money you've been giving away that you couldn't afford to give. None of it. And once I knew, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't just go back to my life and let you keep carrying this alone. I wasn't asking you to carry anything. Her voice had an edge now, sharper than he'd ever heard from her in 7 years of quiet competence. I never asked you for help. I never asked anyone for help. I told Carol I'd figure it out, and I was figuring it out by working 16-hour days for a family that's running you into the ground. Carol told me you've been coughing for a week. She told me a 14-year-old kid asked you if you were dying. Ethan hadn't meant for his voice to rise, but it did, frustration and worry tangling together in a way he hadn't expected. Amelia, there was no version of this where you figured it out in time. The sale was already in motion before you even quit. You were exhausting yourself fighting a fight that was already lost the day the landlord signed with the developer. Then why didn't you just tell me that? Why sneak around behind my back for 3 weeks instead of just... She stopped herself visibly, the anger draining out for a second into something closer to bewilderment. Why does it matter so much to you? You're my former employer. You paid me to clean your house and take care of your son. You don't owe this place anything. You don't owe me anything. Ethan looked at her. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at her in 7 years of polite, professional distance, and found himself saying something he hadn't planned to say at all, something that came up from somewhere underneath the careful business logic of acquisitions and endowments. After Claire died, he said, I used to sit on Noah's nursery floor at 3 in the morning because the house felt too big and too quiet to survive in by myself. I had more money than I knew what to do with, and none of it helped, because grief doesn't care about your bank balance. What helped was small things. A neighbor who took Noah for an afternoon so I could fall apart somewhere private. A nurse who stayed 45 minutes past her shift because she could see I wasn't going to make it through the night otherwise. I never paid any of them back properly. By the time I had the energy to even think about repaying kindness, I'd convinced myself I didn't need it anymore, that I'd handled it on my own. His voice caught, just slightly, and he let it. I watched you walk away from my house with 2 plastic bags, asking for nothing. And something in me recognized exactly what you were doing because I've done the same thing. Carried something alone because asking felt like weakness. And I thought, if I have the means to make sure nobody has to carry this particular weight alone, and I don't use it, what was any of it for? The company, the money, all of it. What's it for, if not for this? The office was silent except for the distant sound of children's voices somewhere down the hall, a television, a kid laughing at something. Amelia's eyes had gone glassy, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second, the way people do when they're trying to hold a wall in place that's already starting to crack. I didn't tell you, she said finally, because kindness was never supposed to be something I did for credit. The day I make it about being noticed is the day it stops being real. I've watched people do good things to be seen doing them, and it always curdles into something else eventually, something about the giver instead of the kid who needed shoes. I didn't want that. I wanted this to just be mine, quietly. Something I did because it needed doing, not because anyone was going to write me a thank you card for it. I understand that, Ethan said. I do. But Amelia, you quit your job. You took on work that's clearly killing you, slowly, trying to outrun a deadline you didn't even know was unbeatable. At some point, quiet generosity becomes something else. It becomes a person disappearing into the thing they're trying to save until there's nothing left of them to save anyone with. She didn't answer right away. She walked to the window of the small office, looking out at the lot behind the building where, in a few weeks, there'd be a new playground instead of a rusted swing set with 2 broken chains, though she didn't know that part yet. Why did the shelter matter so much to you? He asked, gently this time, before any of this. Carol told me a little about where you grew up. I want to hear it from you, if you're willing. Amelia was quiet for a long moment, her back still to him, her shoulders rising and falling with a breath that looked like it cost her something. I was 8 when my mother left, she said finally. Not died, left. Walked out one morning and didn't come back, and there wasn't any extended family willing to take in a kid who wasn't theirs to keep. I went into the system. Different home every year, sometimes every 6 months. Some of them were fine, some of them weren't. The home I was in when I was 12 was the worst. Overcrowded, underfunded, run by people who saw us as a paycheck and nothing else. I used to lie awake at night and think about what it would feel like to matter to someone, to actually matter, not just be tolerated until I turned 18 and they could stop being responsible for me. What changed? There was a woman at one of the later homes, Miss Dolores. She wasn't even my assigned caretaker, technically. She worked nights, cleaning mostly, but she used to sit with the kids who couldn't sleep. One night, I must have been 14, I was crying about something stupid, some boy at school who'd made fun of my secondhand shoes, and she sat down next to me on the floor of the hallway and said, "You know you matter, right? Not because of what you have, because you're here and you're trying, and that's enough." Amelia's voice had gone soft, almost childlike. The particular softness of someone reaching back through years to touch something that had mattered enormously and quietly for a long time. Nobody had ever said that to me before. Not like that. Not in a way that felt true instead of like something adults say to kids to make them stop crying. I never forgot it. When I aged out at 18, no money, no family, nowhere to go, I held on to that one sentence like it was the only solid ground I had. And that's why Sunrise House. I found it by accident, saw a flyer at a laundromat 8 years ago, needing volunteers for a Friday reading program. I almost didn't go. I was barely keeping myself fed back then, working 2 jobs, didn't have time to volunteer anywhere. But something about the flyer made me think of Miss Dolores, and I thought, if nobody ever does for these kids what she did for me, who will? She finally turned back to face him, her eyes wet, but her voice steadier now. So I started going, and then I couldn't stop. Every kid in that building reminded me of myself at some age, in some home, waiting for someone to tell them they mattered. I couldn't walk away from that, not for better pay, not for an easier life, not for anything. Ethan felt his own throat tighten, listening to her, understanding finally the full architecture of the thing. Not charity, not generosity in the abstract sense people threw around at galas and donor dinners, but something closer to a debt she'd taken on at 14 years old without knowing it, paid forward every Friday for 8 years to children who would never know, the woman who first showed her what mattering felt like. I'm not trying to take credit away from you, he said carefully, or take the shelter away from you, or make this about me. I bought the building because I have the means to remove the one thing that was about to take this place away from these kids, permanently, in a way that means you never have to choose between your own survival and theirs again. That's all I want. I want you to be able to keep doing what you've been doing without it costing you your health, your sleep, your entire life. And if I say no, the question came out almost defiant, the last flicker of the pride Carol had warned him about. If I say I don't want your money attached to this place. Ethan had thought about this possibility too in the quiet hours before this conversation, and he answered without hesitation. Then the building's already bought. The fund's already set up. It doesn't go away if you reject it. It's not contingent on your gratitude or your participation. The kids stay housed, the lights stay on, the boiler keeps working whether you ever speak to me again or not. I didn't structure it as a gift to you, I structured it as a gift to them. You can be as involved or as uninvolved as you want. The only thing I'd ask, and here his voice softened further, is that you let yourself rest. Whatever job you take next, let it be one that doesn't run you into the ground. Let yourself have something left over at the end of the week for yourself, for once, because nobody's life should be sustainable only through self-erasure, not even yours. Amelia stared at him for a long moment, and something in her face shifted. Not full surrender, not yet, but the visible loosening of a grip she'd been holding for so long she'd forgotten what her hands felt like without it. Carol knew about this the whole time, she said. It wasn't quite a question. She did. I needed someone on the inside who could tell me how you were doing, because I didn't want to just show up and announce it like a press release. I wanted to do it in a way that respected what you'd built here, not erased it. Ethan hesitated. I'm sorry it took this long. I know you were running yourself into exhaustion this whole time, and a part of me regrets every extra day it took to get the structural work done right instead of fast. But I didn't want to hand you an unfinished promise. I wanted to hand you something that was actually solid. You bought a whole building, Amelia said slowly, like she was still working out the math of it in real time. For kids you'd never met. Because I quit your job and walked here with 2 grocery bags. I bought a building because I followed a woman who I thought I knew and found out I didn't know the first thing about her, and what I found out humbled me more than anything has in years. Ethan took a breath. 7 years, Amelia. You raised my son half the week. You knew his favorite cereal, his nightmares, the exact way he likes his grilled cheese cut. I never once asked you about your life outside my house. I told myself that was respecting your privacy. Looking back, I think it was just convenient not to ask, because asking would have meant I had to care about something beyond whether you showed up on time. I'm not proud of that. This isn't charity, Amelia. This is me trying, badly and probably too late, to be the kind of person who actually sees the people around him instead of just using them. The office was quiet for a long moment. Down the hall, a kid's laugh rang out, high and bright, followed by Carol's voice telling someone to wash their hands before dinner. The ordinary domestic noise of a building that, as of 18 days ago and unbeknownst to most of the people living in it, was no longer hanging by a thread. I don't know how to just accept this, Amelia said finally, quietly. I don't know how to be the person things are done for instead of the person doing them. I've never been good at it. I know, Ethan said. I'm not asking you to be good at it overnight. I'm asking you to let it happen anyway. She let out a breath that shook slightly on its way out, and for the first time since she'd walked into that office, something like relief, real relief, not the braced, suspicious kind from before, moved across her face. She pressed both hands over her eyes for a moment, and when she lowered them, they were wet, and she didn't bother hiding it. The kids, she said. Do they know yet? Not yet. I wanted you to know first. I thought you'd want to be the one to tell them, if you want to be. Amelia let out a small broken laugh, half disbelief, half something warmer. Diego's going to ask if this means we're getting a real basketball hoop instead of the one with the bent rim. There's a basketball hoop in the plans, a good one. And Maya's been asking for a library corner for 2 years. Real shelves, not just a cardboard box of donated books. There's a reading room. Carol picked the paint color herself. Something called Sage Whisper, apparently, which I'm told is very calming. Amelia laughed again, fuller this time, and the sound of it, unguarded, surprised by its own existence, was, Ethan thought, the first genuinely happy thing he'd heard from her in 7 years of knowing her only as the quiet, careful woman who managed his household with flawless competence and revealed nothing of herself in the process. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, the anger gone now, replaced by something gentler, almost wondering. 3 weeks of watching me run myself into the ground, and you knew the whole time it was already handled? Because I wanted to do it right instead of fast, Ethan said again. The same answer, but it landed differently this time, softer, between two people who'd stopped circling each other and started actually talking. And because honestly, I didn't know how to have this conversation. I still don't, completely. I've negotiated 9-figure acquisitions without breaking a sweat, and I spent 2 weeks dreading this exact 10 minutes more than any boardroom I've ever walked into. Why? Because this one actually mattered, he said simply. And I didn't want to get it wrong. Amelia looked at him for a long moment, something settling in her face that hadn't been there since she'd walked through the door. Not full peace, not yet, that would take longer than one conversation, but the beginning of it, the loosening of a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd built her entire identity around the weight of it. "Come tell the kids with me," she said finally, "if you want to. They should know who actually made this happen." "I told you, I know you don't want credit. I'm not asking you to take credit." A small, tired smile crossed her face, the first real smile Ethan had seen from her in this entire conversation. "I'm asking you to come meet the family you just saved, Mr. Calloway. There's a difference." And so Ethan Calloway, who had built an empire on being 2 steps ahead of every room he walked into, found himself, for once, with absolutely no idea what to say, following a woman he'd known for 7 years and was only now beginning to truly meet down a freshly painted hallway toward a room full of children who had no idea yet that the ground beneath them, which had felt like it was crumbling for weeks, had already, quietly, become solid again. The common room was louder than Ethan expected, 12 kids in various states of after-school chaos, a card game in progress on the floor that looked like it had devolved into an argument about rules nobody could agree on, a younger pair coloring at a wobbly table near the window. When Amelia walked in with Ethan a step behind her, the noise didn't stop all at once. It dimmed in waves, kid by kid, as they noticed her first and then, with visible curiosity, the unfamiliar man standing slightly behind her. "Miss Amelia!" The youngest one, the boy who'd thrown his arms up to be carried that first night, abandoned his crayons and barreled toward her. She caught him automatically, the motion so practiced it looked like muscle memory built over years. "Hey, Theo." She pressed a kiss to the top of his head, then looked around the room, finding Diego first, the 14-year-old leaning against the wall with the studied indifference teenagers perform when they want to seem unaffected by something they actually care about deeply. "Can everybody come sit for a minute? I need to tell you something." The shift in the room was immediate. Kids who'd been sprawled on the floor sat up straighter. The card game argument died mid-sentence. Even Diego pushed off the wall and came closer, arms still crossed but his eyes alert now, wary in the particular way of a kid who'd had too many "I need to tell you something" conversations end badly. "Is it bad?" Diego asked, before anyone else could. "Are we getting kicked out?" "No." Amelia's voice cracked slightly on the word, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. "No, baby, we're not getting kicked out. We're never getting kicked out. Not from this building, not ever again." A girl near the front, Maya, Ethan guessed, the one Carol had mentioned wanting a real library corner, frowned in confusion. "But you said the landlord was selling it. You said—" "I know what I said." Amelia crouched down so she was closer to eye level with the younger kid sitting on the floor, Theo still on her hip, his small hand twisted into the collar of her shirt. "Someone bought the building. A really kind person who wanted to make sure none of you ever have to worry about losing this place. The back rent's paid. There's a new boiler, so we're not going to freeze this winter. There's going to be a real library corner, Maya, with actual shelves." Maya's mouth fell open. "Real shelves? Not the cardboard box?" "Real shelves." "And a basketball hoop?" Diego asked, trying and failing to keep the hope out of his voice, the careful teenage mask cracking just slightly. "One that's not bent?" "A real one, with a net." The room exploded. Not all at once, but in a cascading wave, kids talking over each other. Theo bouncing on Amelia's hip and demanding to know if there'd be a trampoline, even though nobody had said anything about a trampoline. The card game forgotten entirely. Carol, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and tears already gathering, watched the chaos with an expression Ethan would remember for a long time. Relief so total it looked almost like grief. The particular exhaustion of someone who'd been bracing for a blow that never landed. "Who bought it?" Maya asked, once the noise settled enough for the question to land. "Who's the person?" Amelia glanced back at Ethan, and something passed between them. Not quite a question, more like an offering, a chance for him to step forward or stay in the background, his choice entirely. Ethan thought about everything Carol had told him in that first hallway conversation, about not making this about himself, about letting it be about the kids. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took Maya's curious, hopeful face to turn toward him, waiting. "My name's Ethan," he said, stepping forward, crouching the way he did with Noah when he needed a kid to really hear him. "I have a son about Theo's age, and I found out that Miss Amelia has been coming here every Friday for 8 years, taking care of all of you, even when it cost her things she needed for herself. I thought that deserved to be protected, so I made sure this place isn't going anywhere." "Are you rich?" Theo asked, with the blunt honesty only a 4-year-old could deploy without consequence. Amelia made a small, mortified sound. "Theo, it's okay." Ethan laughed, the first easy laugh he'd had in this building. "Yeah, buddy, I'm pretty rich. Are you going to buy us a trampoline?" "Theo." "I'll look into the trampoline," Ethan said solemnly, which earned him a triumphant fist pump from a 4-year-old and an exasperated, affectionate eye roll from Amelia that told him, more than anything else in the conversation so far, that some wall between them had genuinely come down. Diego hung back as the younger kid swarmed closer, peppering Ethan with questions about whether the new wiring meant the Wi-Fi would finally work in the back bedrooms, whether the playground would have swings that didn't squeak, whether the new paint smell would ever go away. He waited until the noise crested and broke into smaller conversations before he approached Amelia directly, his voice lower, more careful, the voice of someone old enough to understand what almost losing something really meant. "You quit your job for this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I did." Without knowing if it would work. Without knowing anything, really. Amelia set Theo down, who immediately ran off to recruit allies for an argument about trampoline placement. "I just knew I couldn't watch this place close without trying everything I had." Diego looked at her for a long moment, and something in his 14-year-old face, the careful, guarded thing kids in the system learn to wear early, the thing that protects you from caring too visibly about things that might get taken away, cracked, just slightly. "You always say that you'll figure it out. Every time something goes wrong here, you say that, and somehow it always works out. And I used to think it was just luck. But it's not luck, is it? It's just you, refusing to let it not work out." "Diego, I'm just saying." He shrugged, looking suddenly younger than 14, the careful mask slipping further. "Most people don't stick around for kids like us. My mom didn't. The first 3 homes I was in, they didn't either. Not really. Not past collecting the check. You've been showing up every Friday since I was 6 years old. I don't think you understand what that actually means to people like me." His voice wavered, just barely, and he looked away fast toward the window, blinking hard. "Anyway, thanks for whatever you did to make sure this didn't fall apart." Amelia didn't say anything for a moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had the particular rawness of someone trying very hard to hold a feeling at the size it actually was, instead of letting it overwhelm her in front of a room full of kids who needed her to be steady. "You don't have to thank me, Diego. I'd do it again tomorrow." "I know. That's the point." Ethan, standing a few feet away, watching this exchange unfold, felt something shift permanently in his understanding of what he'd actually bought with 18 days and a renovation budget that had ballooned 3 times past its original estimate. He hadn't purchased a building. He'd purchased the continuation of something that had been quietly saving lives in increments too small for anyone outside this room to ever notice. A Friday here, a pair of shoes there. 8 years of showing up when showing up was the hardest and least glamorous thing a person could choose to do. Carol finally stepped fully into the room, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron, trying to reassert some order over the chaos. All right, everybody calm down before somebody knocks over the new paint cans. Diego, help me get dinner started. Maya, can you get the little ones to wash up? The room slowly organized itself back into its evening routine, kids drifting toward the kitchen, toward the bathroom, toward homework left half-finished on the wobbly table, and Ethan found himself standing near the doorway with Amelia, watching the controlled chaos with something that felt, unexpectedly, like belonging, even though he'd been in this building for less than an hour. "Thank you," Amelia said quietly, not looking at him, watching the kids instead, "for letting them know who actually did this, for not hiding behind the holding company name forever." "I almost did," he admitted. "Right up until the moment Maya asked. I had a whole plan to stay anonymous indefinitely." "What changed your mind?" "Watching their faces when you told them." He paused. "I realized hiding from that would have been its own kind of selfishness, letting myself feel good about doing something good without ever having to actually be present for what it meant to the people it helped. That felt like the easy way out. I didn't want the easy way out anymore." Amelia turned to look at him then, fully, and something in her expression had softened past the wariness of earlier, past even the relief, into something that looked, for the first time, like genuine curiosity about who this man actually was, beyond 7 years of polite distance in his own kitchen. "Walk with me," she said. "I want to show you something before dinner." She led him down the hall, past the reading room that wasn't finished yet, but had its walls freshly painted in that sage color Carol had picked, past a bathroom with new tile that still smelled faintly of grout, to a small room at the end of the corridor that hadn't been part of the original renovation plans, a closet-sized space, barely big enough for a cot and a small dresser, with a single window looking out over the back lot where the playground would eventually go. "This was my room," Amelia said, "for about 1.5 years before I aged out. Different building, different city, but it looked almost exactly like this. Same size, same kind of window." She ran her hand along the windowsill, years of memory visible in the gesture. "I used to sit right here at night and think about what it would feel like to have somewhere permanent, somewhere that wasn't going to be taken away by a budget cut or a closure or a system that just moved you along whenever it got inconvenient to keep you. Is this room used now? It's for whichever kid needs a quiet space. Sometimes a new arrival needs somewhere to decompress before they're ready to join the group. Sometimes an older kid just needs 5 minutes alone." She turned to face him, her back against the window, the last light of the day catching the side of her face. "I wanted you to see it, because I think you bought a building thinking you were fixing wiring and boilers, and that matters. Don't get me wrong, none of this works without that. But what actually matters is this room staying available for the next kid who needs 5 minutes to remember that the world hasn't completely fallen apart yet." Ethan looked around the small space, the cot, the dresser, the window, the particular hush of a room built to hold a kid's fear until it became manageable, and felt the full weight of what this entire endeavor had actually been about settle into him properly for the first time, past the spreadsheets and the contractor calls and the careful financial structuring of an endowment fund. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to actually think about it before you answer, not just give me the answer you think I want to hear. Okay? Would you consider running this place? Not volunteering on Fridays, actually running it. Director or whatever title fits, I'll let you and Carol work that out between yourselves. Full salary, benefits, actual sustainable hours, none of this scraping by on a housekeeper's pay while pouring everything extra into kids who need it. You'd have real resources behind you now. You wouldn't have to choose between your own survival and theirs ever again." Amelia blinked, clearly not having expected this. "Carol runs this place." "Carol's 63. She told me herself the first day I came here that she's been doing this for 11 years, and most of those years felt like running uphill in the rain. I'm not trying to push her out. I want her to stay involved, in whatever capacity she wants, for as long as she wants. But this place needs someone who can carry it for the next 20 years, not the next 5. And I can't think of anyone better suited to that than the person who's already been doing the hardest parts of the job for free, for 8 years, on nothing. I don't have the qualifications. I don't have a degree in social work or nonprofit management, or you have 8 years of actual experience doing the work itself. which counts for more than most of the paperwork people put on resumes. And if you want the degree, the endowment can pay for it. Night classes, online programs, whatever fits around the job. I'm not asking you to become someone else. I'm asking you to do, with real support behind you, exactly what you've already been doing for free. Amelia was quiet for a long moment, looking out the small window at the lot below, where in a few weeks there'd be a working playground instead of rusted, broken equipment. Noah, she said finally, what happens with Noah if I take this on full time? I won't be available the way I was. Noah will be fine. We'll figure out childcare. That's a solvable problem, and frankly, it's one I should have been more present for myself all along instead of outsourcing entirely. He paused. But Amelia, I want to be honest with you about something else too. Noah still talks about you. Every day almost since you left. I think some part of this, bringing you to this conversation, sitting here in this room with you, some part of it isn't just about what's right for Sunrise House. It's about what I owe you, personally, for 7 years of taking care of my son with more warmth than I think I even noticed at the time. I don't want this job offer to feel like it's severing whatever connection you and Noah have. If you want to stay involved with him too, in whatever way makes sense, that door's open. I'm not trying to neatly file you into one role and close out the other. Something in Amelia's face shifted again. The careful composure she'd maintained through the entire conversation finally giving way to something rawer underneath it. You've thought about all of this. Really thought about it. I've had 18 days where I didn't think about much else. Why? The question came out softer this time, less suspicious than it had been in the office earlier, more genuinely curious. I keep asking you why, and your answers keep being good answers, but I still don't fully understand it. You're a billionaire. You could have written a check, walked away, felt good about yourself for a week, and gone back to your life. Instead, you've spent almost 3 weeks personally overseeing structural engineers and renovation timelines and job offers for your former housekeeper. That's not normal billionaire behavior, Mr. Calloway. Most people in your position pay someone else to care so they don't have to. Ethan considered the question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer, not a reflexive one. I think, he said slowly, I spent the last 3 years since Claire died building a very efficient life. Good schools for Noah, good staff, good systems, everything running smoothly so I never had to feel the gaps where she used to be. And it worked, mostly. The business kept growing, Noah kept growing, everything looked fine from the outside. He paused, looking down at his hands. But efficient isn't the same as alive, and somewhere in the last 3 years, I think I forgot the difference. Following you that night, watching you walk into this building and get tackled by a 4-year-old who clearly adores you, listening to you tell Carol you'd figure out an impossible problem with absolutely no resources. It cracked something open in me that I didn't know had gone numb. I wasn't trying to save Sunrise House because it was the efficient thing to do. There was nothing efficient about any of this. I did it because, for the first time in a long time, something mattered enough to make me feel things instead of just manage them. Amelia didn't say anything for a long moment, and when she finally did, her voice was thick. Claire would be glad that you found your way back to feeling things. You knew her? Not well. I started a few months before she passed, but I remember she used to talk about Noah like he was the best thing that had ever happened to either of you, and she used to worry sometimes, out loud, that you worked too much, that you'd forget how to just be present once the business stopped needing every ounce of your attention. Amelia's eyes were wet now, openly. I think she'd be relieved to see this version of you. The one standing in a tiny room in a falling-down children's shelter, asking a former housekeeper to run it, because something mattered enough to make him show up in person instead of writing a check from a distance. Ethan felt his own throat tighten at that, the unexpected mention of Claire landing somewhere he hadn't braced for, somewhere that still ached 3 years on, even when the ache had mostly gone quiet beneath the daily noise of running a company and raising a son. Thank you, he said, for saying that. I don't think anyone said anything like that to me in 3 years. Most people are scared to bring her up, like it'll make you sadder than you already are. Amelia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a small, wry smile breaking through. I've never been very good at avoiding hard things. Comes with the job, I guess. Comes with you, I think. Not the job. They stood there a moment longer in that small room, the light outside fading toward evening, the sound of dinner preparations and kids' voices drifting faintly down the hall, and Ethan understood that whatever had started that night 3 weeks ago, a man following a woman he thought he knew into a part of his own city he'd forgotten existed, had turned into something neither acquisitions nor endowments, nor any of the careful financial language he was fluent in could fully capture. It had turned into the beginning of an actual relationship between two people who had spent 7 years occupying the same house and somehow never once seen each other clearly. I need to think about the job offer, Amelia said finally, as they started back down the hall toward the noise and warmth of the kitchen. Not because I don't want it. I think I do want it, more than I've wanted anything in years. But I need to think it through properly, not just say yes because I'm overwhelmed and grateful, and it's been the most emotional afternoon of my year. Take all the time you need, the offer doesn't expire. And the kids, she added, glancing back toward the common room where Theo's voice could be heard, still relentlessly lobbying for a trampoline. They should be part of choosing how their new home looks, not just adults deciding everything for them, even if the adults mean well. I agree completely. I want this place to feel like it belongs to them, not like a gift handed down from above. Amelia smiled at that, the first full, unguarded smile Ethan had seen from her in 7 years. Not the careful, professional warmth she'd always offered in his own kitchen, but something realer, something that reached all the way to her eyes. You're going to be all right, Mr. Calloway. I don't know exactly what you are to me now. Boss doesn't fit anymore, and I'm not sure what does, but whatever this is, I think it's going to be all right. Ethan, he said. Just Ethan, if that's all right with you. Ethan, she repeated, testing the shape of it, and something about the way she said it, easy and unguarded, told him that whatever distance had separated them for 7 years inside his own house had finally, properly, begun to close. They reached the kitchen doorway just as Carol called everyone to the table, the smell of something simple and warm filling the small dining area, 12 kids and one tired, relieved woman crowding around a table built for fewer people than it currently held, and Ethan Calloway, billionaire, single father, a man who had spent 3 years mistaking efficiency for living, found himself pulling up a folding chair at the edge of the table, staying for dinner in a children's shelter on a Tuesday night, for absolutely no reason except that he didn't want to leave yet. Amelia called him 8 days later, on a Wednesday morning, while Ethan was halfway through a board call he barely remembered finishing once he saw her name on the screen. I'll take the job, she said, no preamble, the way she did most things. Director of Sunrise House. I talked it through with Carol. She wants to stay on 3 days a week. Mentoring, nothing more. Says her knees have earned the retirement even if her stubbornness hasn't caught up yet. And I signed up for an online nonprofit management program. Starts in the fall. That's good. That's really good, Amelia. There's a condition. Ethan felt himself smile, alone in his office, the board call's leftover documents still scattered across his desk. Of course there is. Noah comes to visit, not as a publicity thing, not as some feel-good photo op for your company's social media. Just because he asked about the kids 3 times last week, according to your assistant, who I ran into at the grocery store, by the way, small world, and because I think it would be good for him to know kids whose lives look different from his own, not as charity, as friends. I'd like that. I think he would too. That was how it started, not with a grand gesture, but with a 5-year-old's persistent curiosity and a director's quiet condition, and over the following months it became something neither of them had fully planned for, the kind of thing that grows in the spaces between intention and habit, until one day you look up and realize it's simply become your life. The renovation finished properly in October, 6 weeks after that first conversation in the small back room, and Ethan made sure this time that he wasn't standing at the edges of the unveiling. He stood in the middle of it, in the new common room with its fresh paint and its actual library corner with actual shelves, Noah's small hand gripped tight in his own. Watching Diego sink the first official shot through the new basketball hoop with the net that didn't catch and tear. Watching Maya run her fingers along a row of donated books like she was greeting old friends. Watching Theo demand loudly and repeatedly to know where exactly the trampoline was, because a promise was a promise. There's no trampoline yet, Ethan told him, crouching down to the boy's eye level. But I'm working on it. You said you'd look into it. I am looking into it. Insurance for trampolines is apparently very complicated. Theo considered this with the gravity small children bring to matters of profound personal importance. Okay, but soon. Soon, Ethan agreed, and meant it. And 3 months later, there actually was a trampoline, properly fenced and padded and insured within an inch of its life. Because once Ethan Calloway committed to something, he tended to see it through completely, a trait that had built his company and was now, somewhat to his own surprise, rebuilding something closer to his actual character. Noah took to the other kids faster than Ethan expected. He'd worried, in the lead up to that first visit, that his son, raised in a house with a private chef and a heated pool and tutors who came to him instead of the other way around, might feel foreign in a building like Sunrise House, might say something innocently thoughtless about toys or vacations that would land wrong with kids who had so much less. Instead, Noah and Theo bonded almost instantly over a shared fanatical love of a cartoon about robot dinosaurs that Ethan had never heard of and immediately wished he could unhear about, given how often it now came up at dinner. Diego, despite being a decade older, took a quiet, protective interest in Noah that reminded Ethan uncomfortably of an older brother, the kind of relationship Noah had never had and clearly craved more than Ethan had realized. He's a good kid, Diego told Ethan one Saturday afternoon, watching Noah and Theo attempt with limited success to build a fort out of couch cushions in the newly finished common room. Doesn't act like he's better than anybody. A lot of rich kids, when they visit places like this, and we get a few, school groups, charity things, they act like they're slumming it for an hour before they go back to their real life. He's not like that. I worry about that, about him growing up thinking the world owes him things just because we have money. He won't, I don't think, not with Miss Amelia around him as much as she is. Diego shrugged, the careful teenage indifference cracking slightly the way it did sometimes, around the edges, when he said something he actually meant. She's got a way of making sure kids understand the difference between having things and deserving things. She did it for all of us. I figure she'll do it for him too, if you let her. Ethan thought about that a lot in the months that followed. The strange, unplanned symmetry of it. That the woman who had spent 8 years quietly saving children with nothing of their own was now, in a sense, helping to raise his son alongside her own found family, blurring a line he hadn't expected to blur between the household he'd built around grief and efficiency and the one Amelia had built around showing up, week after week, for people who had nobody else. He and Amelia didn't fall into anything dramatic. There was no single moment, no movie kiss in a doorway, nothing he could point to later and say that was when it changed. It changed the way most real things change, gradually, through 100 ordinary Tuesdays. She'd call him about a maintenance issue at the shelter, and the call would run 40 minutes instead of 5, because they'd ended up talking about something else entirely. His work, her classes, a memory of Claire that surfaced unprompted, and that he found himself, for the first time in years, able to talk about without flinching. He started showing up at Sunrise House more than the visits with Noah strictly required, helping Carol sort donations on a Thursday evening, fixing a sticking door himself instead of calling a contractor, mostly because he discovered he liked being there, liked the particular chaos and warmth of a building full of kids who had learned slowly that this billionaire who'd bought their home wasn't going anywhere either. "You don't have to keep coming," Amelia told him one evening in November, watching him struggle with a wrench on the door hinge with considerably less competence than his net worth might have suggested. "The endowment's running fine. You've done more than enough." "I know I don't have to." "Then why do you?" He set the wrench down and looked at her, the hallway lit by the warm, slightly uneven glow of a lamp Maya had picked out for the reading corner. The building settled into its evening quiet, most of the kids upstairs finishing homework or arguing about whose turn it was for the shower. "Because I like it here," he said simply. "Because for 3 years after Claire died, I built a life that ran efficiently and felt almost nothing, and then I followed you home one night and found this place, and it's the first thing in 3 years that's made me feel like I'm actually living instead of managing. I don't want to give that up just because the immediate crisis is over." Amelia didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize. Careful, weighing, the look of a woman who had spent so long protecting herself from depending on anyone that even good things arrived. for her, wrapped in caution. I'm not very good at this, she admitted finally, whatever this is becoming. I've spent my whole life taking care of other people, and I don't really know how to let someone take care of me, even a little, without feeling like I'm failing at something. I know. I've watched you not know how to do that for months now. He smiled gently, no mockery in it. I'm not in a hurry, Amelia. I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere, not because of an endowment or a job title, because I want to be here. It was Carol, 3 weeks later, who finally said out loud what neither of them had quite managed to, catching Ethan in the kitchen one evening while Amelia was upstairs settling a dispute over bunk bed assignments. You two are going to dance around each other until one of these kids says something blunt enough to force the issue, she said, stirring a pot of something on the stove without looking up. Probably Theo. He's got no filter, and he's already asked me twice if you're going to be his new daddy. Ethan nearly choked on the coffee he was drinking. He asked you that? Last Tuesday. I told him that's not really something a 4-year-old gets to decide, but between you and me, Ethan, I think the kid's onto something the rest of us are being too careful to say outright. Carol finally looked up, her expression softer than her words. She loves you. I've known that woman for 8 years, and I've never seen her let her guard down with anyone the way she has with you these past few months. And I think you love her too, watching the way you look at her when she's not paying attention. Whatever you two are waiting for, the right timing, the right words, permission from somewhere, I'd stop waiting. Life's too short, and these kids have had enough disappearing acts in their lives. They need to see something that lasts. He thought about that conversation walking home that night, the cold air sharp in his lungs, the city lights blurring slightly at the edges the way they do when you're thinking too hard to fully focus on anything in front of you. He thought about Claire, about the particular guilt that still sometimes surfaced at the idea of loving someone else, and about the fact that the last time he'd let himself feel this unguarded around another person, it had ended in a hospital room he still couldn't think about directly, even 3 years later. He thought about Noah, who'd started, in the last month, calling Amelia by a name that wasn't quite Miss Amelia anymore. Something softer, something that made Ethan's chest tighten every time he heard it. He told her 2 weeks later, on a Friday evening, the same day of the week she'd been coming to Sunrise House faithfully for 8 years before any of this started, standing in that same small back room with the cot in the window, the room she'd once told him reminded her of being 14 and alone, and certain nobody would ever choose to stay. I love you, eh? He said, no preamble, the way she did most things, because he'd learned that from her too, somewhere in the last few months. I don't know exactly when it started. Maybe the night I followed you here. Maybe before that. Maybe some part of me already knew there was something in you worth following, even when I didn't have words for it. I just know I don't want to keep being careful about it anymore. Amelia was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with an expression that held both the old caution and something newer, something that had been building slowly through every Thursday evening and every 40-minute phone call that should have lasted 5 minutes. I'm scared, she said finally, honestly. Not of you. Of what happens to me if I let myself need this and it doesn't last. I've built my whole life around being the person who doesn't need anything, because needing things means someone can take them away. I can't promise nothing will ever go wrong. I lost Claire with no warning at all, so I know better than most people that promises like that don't mean anything. He reached for her hand and she let him take it. But I can promise I'm not disappearing. Not on you, not on Noah, not on any of the kids down that hallway who've already had too many people disappear on them. I'm staying, for all of it. However long this takes you to trust. She cried then, finally, fully, the way Carol had described her crying that very first night Ethan had stood outside a cracked window, listening to a conversation that had changed the direction of his entire life. Except this time, there was no window between them, no distance. Just two people standing in a small room that had once been built to hold a child's fear, now holding something closer to the opposite of fear. They married the following spring, quietly, in the backyard of the Calloway estate, though by then the word estate had started to feel almost wrong for a house that had, slowly, filled with the noise and clutter of children's drawings and forgotten shoes and the particular chaos of a blended family finding its shape. Noah was the ring bearer, deadly serious about his responsibilities, walking down the small aisle of folding chairs with a pillow clutched to his chest like state secrets were riding on it. Theo, dressed in a small suit he'd insisted on picking out himself, declared loudly during the vows that he thought weddings were actually pretty cool, way cooler than I thought, which got a laugh from the entire gathering and a mortified hush from Carol that lasted exactly 4 seconds before she started laughing too. Diego, 17 by then, and visibly trying not to let anyone see how much the day meant to him, gave a brief, halting toast at the small reception that ended with him saying, simply, "Some people show up once and call it enough. Miss Amelia never did that. I'm glad somebody finally showed up for her the same way." Sunrise House, by then, had become something Carol could barely recognize from the building it had been a year earlier. Not because it had lost what made it special, but because everything that had always made it special now had the resources to actually thrive instead of merely survive. The reading corner had become a small library, expanded twice as donations followed. Once people learned the place had genuinely turned a corner. The trampoline had arrived, fully insured, exactly as promised, and had already required 2 minor repairs from overuse, which Ethan considered a sign of success rather than failure. A counselor came twice a week now, paid through the endowment, helping kids work through things that bedtime stories and warm meals couldn't fully reach. Maya, who'd wanted real shelves more than anything in the world, had started talking about wanting to be a librarian herself one day. And Amelia had quietly begun setting aside scholarship funds for any kid who aged out of the system wanting to pursue something, anything, that mattered to them. Because she remembered, better than anyone, what it felt like to age out with nothing. And she had decided, the moment the resources existed, that no child who passed through Sunrise House would ever face that particular cliff edge alone again. Ethan still ran his company, still closed deals, still sat in boardrooms negotiating numbers large enough to make most people's heads spin. But the shape of his weeks had changed permanently. Thursday evenings were Sunrise House evenings now, a standing commitment blocked into his calendar with the same seriousness as any board meeting, and he'd started, almost without realizing it, mentoring a few of the older kids the way nobody had really mentored him at that age, talking Diego through college applications, helping another teenager named Priya think through a business idea for a small baking venture she wanted to start, treating their futures with the same careful attention he'd once reserved only for 9-figure acquisitions. On the 1-year anniversary of the night he'd followed Amelia home with nothing but instinct and a strange, persistent ache in his chest, Ethan stood once again at the window of his study, watching the same gold evening light fall across the same driveway. Except this time Amelia stood beside him, her hand resting easily in his. And Noah and Theo were somewhere downstairs arguing about whose turn it was to pick the movie, their voices carrying up through the house, with the particular chaos of children who had stopped, somewhere along the way, treating each other as anything other than brothers. "Do you ever think about it?" Amelia asked. "That night, what would have happened if you hadn't followed me?" Ethan considered the question seriously, the way he'd learned to consider most things she asked him. "I think about it more than I probably should. I think about how close I came to just letting you walk away with your 2 plastic bags, and going back inside to put Noah to bed, telling myself it wasn't my business, that you'd quit, and that was that." He pulled her slightly closer. "I think about how much of both our lives ran on autopilot before that night. Me managing my grief instead of feeling it. You carrying an entire building's worth of need without ever letting anyone carry any of it with you. We were both so good at looking fine from a distance. And up close? Up close, neither of us was fine at all. We were just both very good at hiding it, in completely different ways." He kissed the top of her head, the gesture as ordinary now as breathing, after a year of practice. "I think that's the part people miss when they hear stories like ours. They want it to be about the money, about a billionaire swooping in and fixing everything with a checkbook. But the money was never really the point. The point was that I actually looked. For the first time in years, I stopped managing my life from a safe distance and actually looked at someone, really looked. And what I found changed both of us." "Carol still tells people the story wrong, you know," Amelia said, a small smile in her voice. "Tells the new volunteers you bought the building because you fell in love with me at first sight, like it's some kind of fairy tale. It wasn't first sight. It took me 7 years to actually see you. Better late than never." Down in the kitchen, Theo's voice rose in a triumphant shout about having won the movie argument, followed immediately by Noah's good-natured protest, and the sound of both boys thundering toward the den, and somewhere underneath that ordinary domestic noise, Ethan found himself thinking about everything that had started with 2 plastic bags and a sadness he couldn't ignore. About Miss Dolores and a sentence spoken to a frightened 14-year-old in a hallway decades ago. About a 4-year-old's arms raised to be carried. About a building that had nearly fallen and instead had become the center of an unlikely, expanding family that nobody, least of all Ethan himself a year earlier, could have predicted. He understood now, in a way he hadn't fully understood standing at that same window 12 months before, that wealth had never been the measure of anything that actually mattered. Amelia had owned almost nothing the night she walked out his gate, and she had still been, to a dozen children in a crumbling building 3 blocks away, the richest person any of them had ever known. Not because of what she could give them, but because of what she refused to stop giving even when she had nothing left to spare. And Ethan, who had spent years believing his fortune was the most significant thing he'd ever built, had finally learned that the only wealth that actually lasted, the only kind that followed you home at the end of the day and sat with you through the quiet hours, was the kind measured in the people who showed up for you and the people you chose, in turn, to show up for. Outside, the gold light finally faded into the soft blue of early evening, the same way it had a year ago. The same gravel driveway, the same gate, but nothing else about that view or about the man standing in front of it was the same at all. And as Amelia leaned her head against his shoulder and the boy's laughter rang up through the house one more time, Ethan thought, with a certainty he hadn't possessed in years, that whatever came next, more challenges at the shelter, more growing pains in a family stitched together from 2 very different kinds of loss, they would meet it the same way they'd met everything since that first cold night on a cracked sidewalk. Together, and without ever again pretending they didn't need each other.